Over the past few years, the topic of mental health has become more popular than ever, with more awareness, more research, and more people discussing their issues. The problem though at times is that there is too much information. There are clickbait articles, there is Dr. Google, and we find that there are more pressure on people today than ever before. On this episode of the Self-Made podcast, I speak to Dr. Sarah Vohra. Sarah used to be a client of mine over a decade ago, and it's been a pleasure to reconnect in the last few months. She's a clinical psychiatrist working for the NHS and dealing hands-on with people who struggle with their mental health. In her spare time, she's taken to social media to spread awareness on proactive tips to deal with your own mental health and solve problems before they become problems. And this is what we discuss in this episode of the show. We talk about what you can do today to not only ensure that your mental health doesn't deteriorate, but also to optimize it for your own productivity, for your own happiness, for your own compassion. We talk about what the end goal is. Is the goal to be happy? Is the goal to be content? Is the goal to be okay with what life throws at us? We talk about social media. Is mental health issues more prevalent than ever before? Or are we just hearing more about it? We have you proactive advice of what you can do about your sleep, about your life, around your social media, around comparison syndrome to maximize your day, and how to go out, get help, or speak to a friend who you feel may be struggling. If you enjoy this episode, please go and follow Sarah at The Mind Medic on Instagram. Her content is absolutely phenomenal. And if you enjoy the show, please share on social media, tagging myself and Sarah. And without further ado, I will leave you myself and Dr. Sarah Vohra. So Sarah, I've been really looking forward to this chat. As I said, I said off air that you were my client 10 years ago. You were my client back in Birmingham Virgin Active, and I stumbled across your profile probably a year or so ago, and was like, I was astounded. One, how good your content was, and how well you've done in the space. And I thought there's so much value in what you do that I think the more people that can hear it, the better. So for people that don't know who you are, before we go into questions, tell us a little about who Dr. Sarah Vohra is.
Great. It's really great to reconnect on here as well, Simon. So I'm Dr. Sarah Vohra, also known as the Mind Medic on Instagram, and I'm a consultant psychiatrist. So I've got over 12 years experience in the mental health space. I've been a doctor for 14 years, and day to day I work for the NHS, and I work with individuals that struggle with their mental health, who have mental health difficulties or disorders. And outside of that, I use social media as a platform to share daily mental wellbeing tips. And I was saying to you earlier that this really came about out of frustration. I was finding so much misinformation online. And I think that can be really quite dangerous, because I think people often are in a vulnerable place. And actually, when they're seeking information online, whether it's through Dr. Google or through social media platforms, they tend to hone in on the sort of golden ticket, or hone in on sort of the misinformation. And there's no way of kind of critically appraising that information. I think what I wanted to bring to the table really was evidence-based advice, and advice delivered from an expert lens, or through an expert lens. So I started my Instagram platform really as a way of kind of cutting through that misinformation, sharing daily mental wellbeing tips. And I'm a real advocate for actionable tips. What I want people to do and take away from my page is, this is something that you can introduce to your day-to-day from tomorrow. And it's something that doesn't have to be particularly overwhelming. It can be as a smaller goal as you want it to be, but the idea of it moving in the right direction. So it's a bit of a balance at the moment. My clinical work is incredibly busy at the moment. But also I do enjoy social media, sharing content that I think people are going to find helpful.
I think, and you mentioned this about it's good to be able to reconnect on here. I think one of the beauties of social media, what I found, for all the negatives, and we might speak about some of the impacts of social media have on people in that realm, I think it can be framed so positively. I've known since starting this podcast just over a year ago, I've made new friends. I have reconnected with people through social media and used it as what it's meant to be, and that's social. But one of the other things I think social media is really good at is bringing nuance to topics that doesn't have nuance. And I think mental health is one of those things. As you said, you're looking at Dr. Google and you're looking at clickbait. And when I look at mental health advice online, you either see like people using Dr. Google and everything's the worst case scenario, or is a headline to get people down a wormhole. When in reality, everything is so nuanced and everything isn't the most extreme thing. And actually connecting with someone, like whether it's yourself, Dr. Julia, all the other kind of people that are doing what you're doing, you're creating a person to create a little bit of a middle ground and find out where someone actually is. So they're not getting scared online or not getting scared in sort of social media. So going into a little bit about the mental health stuff and how people can help that. One of the things I think I listened to a podcast you did recently, and you had a conversation about something I thought was really resonated with me, is that often we don't actually know where the end goal is. So like, I think it's potentially understood that people look at mental health and the end goal and the goal, what they're aiming for, is quite vague. So what do you define as sort of like mentally healthy?
So I think you've hit the nail on the head there in terms of it is a constant daily journey. So you could be on top of the world one day and then come crashing down the following day. I think for me, mentally healthy is a sort of a happy medium, a balance between kind of more positive moments that bring you joy, and moments that challenge you and are a bit more difficult to process. And I think in terms of mentally healthy, it's not to say that you'll never experience a negative emotion, but I think it's your ability to process that emotion objectively and to reframe it and to work through it and come out the other side. I think where we kind of become mentally unhealthy or go into what's called mental illness or disorder is when we're experiencing more negative emotions more persistently, that it's affecting everything from our social interactions, our working life, sort of our personal health, our attention to our self-cares. So I think it is a constant journey. And I think, you know, just kind of going back to when we first met, for instance, I had just moved from Leeds, a city that I absolutely adored, and come to Birmingham. And I thought, I'm alone. I've left all my friends behind. What is part of me? What's inbuilt in me? And I knew that the gym was the first place that I go to when I struggle with my mental health. And actually, I was in a space where I thought, actually, the gym's a perfect place to start, to meet new people, to do something that I enjoy. And actually, inherently, exercise is going to be something that's going to be very positive for my mental health. Now, if I started to gain the benefits of the exercise from the social connection in the gym, and then suddenly abruptly stopped and reverted back to being in my flat in Birmingham, you know, all evening, all day, other than going for work, actually that's not going to be great for my mental health. So I think it's important that when you do find something that is helping you, not to stop it abruptly. And actually the key is finding something that you can embed into your day-to-day that becomes a habit and is consistent. So I think there can often be this idea that there is an end goal, and once you attain that end goal, then actually you don't need to be doing all the stuff that got you there. But absolutely you need to maintain the progress that you've made and to maintain good mental health.
It's exactly the same thing I see with clients when you think all the problems are solved by getting a six-pack. And it's as good as thing is, there's never been a single result I've ever had where I've looked at the end result and going, that's the most important part of that journey. It's the things along the way. It's how they've developed as a person from getting out their comfort zone, pushing past challenges and overcoming them. There's actually been the difference in them, not the apps, because that sort of will come and go as life and priorities change.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was actually what was really refreshing about your attitude. So even 10 years ago, I remember we kind of spoke about aesthetic goals, but it was more of a kind of, if that's what you want. But the real focus, and what really struck me about you and why I stuck with you, was actually there was a real drive even from that early stage, because I think the fitness industry has changed remarkably in 10 years. But I think early on, you were very clear that, you know, you could do that, but actually you want to do something that is sustainable, something that you enjoy doing, something that's going to get you up in the morning to come to the gym in the first place, and something that's going to improve your mental and physical health. So I feel like you were ahead of the game with that one.
I appreciate that. I also think there's a momentum side of things as well as a knock-on effect on other stuff. Like I remember there's a trainer I used to work with called Umar Malik, who I always plug on this podcast because he's a phenomenal coach and a really good friend of mine. But he was so good on the gym floor and making his clients train really, really, really hard. And because of that, he had to do less admin, less follow-up, less accountability with his clients because they enjoyed the workout so much that when they left, they're like, I don't want to ruin that by going to McDonald's and having this burger, so I want to eat better, as opposed to having that battle of, you said you wanted to score, but your actions aren't, matching with what you're actually doing. Do you think when it comes to people now looking to pursue their mental health, do you think we're doing more harm than good by looking for being happy as the end goal?
I think for all social media absolutely does have its positives for the reason that you mentioned around connection. I have a lot of patients that I work with where social media has allowed them that social connection that they otherwise couldn't forge in real life. And actually for them, it has been remarkable in bringing them out of their shell. But I think the negatives really from social media are that elusive highlights reel. I think it still very much exists. I think a lot of the time people do portray their highlights, this image of perfection. So I think it's really hard not to want to strive for that when you're inundated with it, when you're inundated with all this information. And one of the things that I always talk to people about is thinking about how you start your day, because I know I'm guilty, I'm terrible for it, that I tried with the old-fashioned alarm clock, and being a doctor and working on calls, I do have to have my phone by my bedside, unfortunately, but then it doubles up as my alarm clock. So what I end up doing is I snooze my alarm, and it's like, oh, okay, what else do I have to distract me in the morning, first thing, before I've even got out of bed and brushed my teeth? I'm looking at emails that have come in. I'm looking at social media and thinking, oh my God, that person's been up an hour and they've done a workout, they're having their breakfast and they're on their way to work already. And instantly my pace of morning, my pace of my day is set up by this sense of urgency, this sense of inadequacy, like, oh my God, they're doing it, how come I can't do it? What's the point? I might as well just, sit here in bed and not do anything. So I think all too often what we end up doing in our day in the morning can really set us up for either a sort of a fail or a gain mentality. And I think what's really important is if you're finding yourself looking at your phone, looking at those glossy images and comparing yourself, it's thinking about what are the things that you need to do first thing on a morning before you invite the rest of the world in. I think we're all too quick to invite the world in before we've even got ourselves up, dressed, done a workout maybe. I know I'm someone that I have to do a workout in the morning, otherwise it will never happen at all. But I know the biggest mistake I can make is looking at my phone before I've done that, because if, say, something's kicked off at work, I suddenly forego that workout. I suddenly have a quicker shower. I suddenly think I'll get breakfast on the go. And all the things that I need to do to make myself the best version of myself suddenly get lower and lower down on the priority list because I've suddenly been taken over by someone else's sense of urgency.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think as well, one of the things that I really trying consciously to avoid now is notifications for certain apps on my phone. And in particular, I've taken off WhatsApp notification on my phone. And especially in coaching, and I presume you will get this in a clinical practice as well, there's such an emotional connection to where your clients are at and the people that you work with. So if I wake up to a message that's, whether it's positive or negative, as soon as I get that changed my state first thing. And now I'm running my day being reactive rather than proactive about what I want to do. So how would you recommend people start making those barriers in the day? Like, whether it's someone who can actually set barriers in the day, or whether it's someone like yourself who you said, I have to have my phone by my bedside. How do you create barriers around that obvious obstacle?
So I think you mentioned notifications. That for me is a must. Wherever I can, I mute notifications. I mute Instagram notifications. I mute my WhatsApp, mute messages. Overnight, it's literally phone calls only. That is the only means that work would contact me anyway. So that for me is a personal boundary. I think the biggest thing that people maybe can do, and it's a really, really simple exercise, is think about your day and think about moments that can bring on stress during your day. So think about the time that you might wake up in the morning, when you might have breakfast, lunch, what time you get to work, what your general temperament's like. So let me give an example of my long-suffering husband, Ravi. So Ravi gets up at 6 o'clock in the morning and he snoozes his alarm. First thing, he gets his breakfast. And then he gets himself changed and goes off to work about 7:30. And generally, he's really prompt to work. He has a good relationship with his colleagues. He breaks for lunch after morning surgery and returns home normally 6, 6:30, has dinner. And again, really mild-mannered, generally is someone who's very, very positive. We might sit down on an evening, watch a box set together, and then he goes to bed about 10, half 10. So if I was noticing that he suddenly seemed a lot more irritable, that actually that morning alarm was getting snoozed later and later, that he was skipping out the door but not having his breakfast, that work was starting to make complaints about him, that he was coming in and he was being irritable with our daughter, he didn't want to sit down and watch a box set, immediately that makes me wonder, okay, what's going on with his mental or physical health? Because there's a shift from what his baseline's like. So the first thing I put to people is think about what your average baseline. Obviously, no one day is alike, but there's a general pattern to what you do day to day. And then think about what might have changed. So, for instance, he may have got into an argument with someone at work, which may have just offset him for a bit, in which case you'd have an expectation that with time that he'd return back to baseline. It might be that he's going through a difficult time with a friend, in which case you think about, actually, is there anything that he can do with that friend to resolve that? Then now thinking about sort of the shifts in baseline that might impact him day to day. So if he's going to bed later and later, there's things that you can immediately change to try and improve his mental well-being. We know that sleep is hugely important, for instance, for our mental health. So if I was finding that he was not getting to bed until midnight, it's about setting boundaries and thinking, okay, you're not getting to bed until midnight. We know that if you're not sleeping, that your performance the following day is going to be impacted. You're going to be getting up later. You're probably not going to feel hungry, because we know that poor sleep can impact our appetite, because it is really hugely important in regulating our appetite. So there are things that he can start to introduce to try to shift himself back to baseline. So again, it's not going to be the same for everyone. For him, it may be as simple as, okay, getting to bed at 10 o'clock and making sure all his devices are switched off half an hour before bed, and sticking at it, being consistent. I think there can be often this myth that you make the change once. I've tried an early night once. It's not going to work. So you pack it in. But what's really important is when there has been a shift from your baseline, is introducing those sort of positive changes. Maybe it's he stopped working out, and actually that was really beneficial for his mood, for his sleep. So introducing exercise daily as well. So I think the key really is thinking about your day to day. Has there been a shift in your baseline? Have the positive things that you introduced to your day to day, have you let those slide? And if possible, can you reintroduce those? So boundaries around sleep, boundaries around your screen use, and also thinking about things like exercise and daily movement. And if there still hasn't been a change and there's things are actually getting worse, then that may be the point that you seek professional help. And it may be recognizing at what point, okay, this is beyond my level of competency and I need to seek professional support for it.
Do you think having sort of like a structure and system to your day, as you were saying there, is that really important as well for helping people achieve goals and actually try and pursue something? Because I feel that so many people are waiting for motivation to act on something, whether it's a health goal, a fitness goal, a mental health goal, something like this, that what they are lacking in is discipline, because they are doing it when they feel like it, as opposed to trying to create that consistency. Like if someone's coming to you and maybe they're overwhelmed, they're anxious, they're stressed, there's a lot going on in their head. How do we create consistency in a very cluttered mind?
Yeah. And I think the thing is, it can go one of two ways, because if you're someone like me, I absolutely love structure and routine. But for someone else, it may actually just exacerbate that stress, because if they're not meeting those goals, or if the structure hasn't gone a certain way, then they think, well, it's no point, and they throw it all out the window and they don't even try the bare minimum. For me, there are absolute non-negotiables to the day that I would really recommend that everyone tries to include. So the first and foremost is that setting yourself 30 minutes phone-free zone first thing on a morning, and doing whatever you need to do to set you up for the day. It's not to say that as you get into your day, things are not going to stress you out. Of course they will. But actually, if you know that you're dressed, or you've done your morning workout, whatever it is you need to do to make you feel like the best possible version of yourself, then actually those things feel easier to process than if you were to just go into the day with, set by someone else's pace. So I think phone-free zone first thing on the morning, however long you can manage in order to do the thing that you need to do to set you up for the day. I think we can't underestimate enough. I think the pandemic was hugely enlightening for this, about the importance of natural daylight. So I think, particularly as we're getting into the winter months, thinking about how much exposure you have to natural daylight, I can't stress enough actually how important it is to help regulate things like your sleep, but in turn things like your mood and appetite. So first thing on a morning, trying to make that distinction between your nighttime and your daytime. So if you're someone that normally has a morning coffee, if you have access to a communal space or a garden, having your morning coffee outside, so exposure for at least 20 to 30 minutes. And that really helps encourage the production later on of a really important hormone called melatonin. And melatonin is absolutely crucial to help us with a good night's sleep. The other thing is exercise, and it doesn't have to be a HIIT workout. It has to be just some form of movement for at least 30 minutes. So again, it's not about an aesthetic goal. I think a lot of the time when we have looked at social media images, there is a real push and a real drive for aesthetic goals. And for a lot of people, that might be their primary focus. But actually, I cannot stress enough how important exercise is for your mental health. And actually, the thing that it can do is help improve your mood. It can help reduce stress. It can also help regulate your sleep and appetite. So again, it's hugely important to introduce that. So even if it is a walk around the block, even if it is getting your arbitrary 10,000 steps a day, something that is going to get you moving each day, however you can do it. And it has to be something that's realistic. If it's not realistic for you to jump on a spin bike, don't do it. Think about something that you can do in the longer term.
Do you think with regards to the physical goal of getting outside and doing some exercise, you mentioned getting outside and being in sunlight, do you think the first step for many people is actually doing something physical, like the physical act will change the mind as opposed to doing something for the mind to change the body? So a lot of people try and start with meditation and starting things to control their mind. Would they actually be better served maybe starting with something physical and maybe building confidence in themselves, which in turn make them look after themselves better? Or is it really case by case?
I think it's case by case because, for some people, actually something low impact like yoga or Pilates might be enough of a movement for them. For some people, it may not be the exercise itself, but it may be an opportunity to catch up with a friend, just walk the park with a friend or walk a dog with a friend. So I don't think it's necessarily needing to be sort of making that distinction between what's more mentally served and what's physically served. But actually, I think it's just the very act of just getting your body moving. So what I would sort of urge people to think is it's individual. Find something that you enjoy. Find something that maybe you can do with someone else. And one of the things that I can't stress enough is the people that you surround yourselves with. So family and friendships, we know that they can have a huge impact on our mental health. And there is research to suggest that actually in times of stress, the people that we surround ourselves with, particularly those that can meet our need, can help us make sense of that stress and reduce the effect that it would otherwise have on us. So actually making sure that you're surrounding yourself with positive people that help and support you. And that can be something maybe that you do alongside your daily movement. The other thing that I'd encourage people to think about is their screen use day to day, because we know that screens, particularly as we get into the evening, can impact our ability to sleep. So screens emits blue light, and blue light blocks melatonin, which is a really important hormone that triggers the pathways for sleep. So if you're someone like myself or my husband, where you're doing this multi-screen tasking in the evening, you've got the laptop out, you've got the phone scrolling, you're looking and watching a box set.
I've got a light. I've got a light here. I've got a light here. I've got a light behind me here. Your microphone, phone, laptop. Yeah.
So we're constantly connected, and it's not realistic for me to say, right, you need to be in bed at 8 p.m. That's not realistic. But think of, for you, what is a realistic bedtime? And half an hour to an hour before then, make it a device-free zone. So for someone, it may be that realistically, they won't get to bed till about 11. So I would say 10:30, switch off all your devices and make it a device-free zone. And whether it's having a bath, so baths are brilliant. It's not an old wives' tale, but baths are brilliant for dropping our core temperature, our core body temperature, which can also help aid with sleep. So whether it's a bath, reading a book, reading a magazine, and when I say book, avoiding e-devices as well. So I think there can be a misconception that even your sort of trusty Kindle is safe, but we know that actually even Kindles can block melatonin, sort of the light that they emit. So it's, if you can, an old-fashioned print book is best, or a print magazine. But again, there's no size fits all. Someone may be listening to this and thinking, I'm not interested in reading a book, but actually the bath sounds like something that I could commit to. So it's finding something.
Think about like blue light blocking glasses and flux and things like this. Are these useful, or are they actually not making as much of an impact as people think?
So the reason I don't advocate for them is because I don't think it's necessarily just the blue light that impacts our ability to sleep. It's the content that we're consuming. So say, for instance, if you're watching a really harrowing documentary with your blue light glasses on, it's not so much necessarily the blue light that's a problem, but actually the content of what you're consuming, may have you on a heightened sense of alerts. I know someone that I'm terrible if I'm watching real crime, for instance, on an evening, that I cannot switch off if I'm going to bed, if I've literally just consumed that content. So I would encourage, if you are going to do the device-free time, just to try not to do it with the screen, because I almost feel it defeats the purpose. So wherever possible, and that's why I always kind of give a bit of leeway and say 30 minutes to an hour, because for some people an hour just isn't realistic, and I'd rather they commit to something than nothing at all. So in terms of kind of, sort of those daily practices, it's thinking about how you start your day. So device-free time in the morning, getting outside for morning, for your daylight, daily movement, thinking about the people that you surround yourself with, and also thinking about your screen time in the evening. And I think if you stick to those 5 things, you can't go far wrong.
No, I totally agree. I think the one thing I've realized so much over the last few years is the people you surround yourself with and how much an impact it makes. And how it's not the same for everybody. Like everyone needs to go out and find those people that rejuvenate them and make them feel good. I know for me, inspiration is huge. If I'm in an environment that isn't inspiring, some people might seek comfort, some people might seek relaxation, but I want people that inspire me. And if I don't have that, sometimes I almost get a bit, not so much down on myself, but just feel like I'm stuck. I'm stagnant. I'm in a rut. And if you put me in a new room, immediately that changes. And there's not actually anything wrong other than my environment. And if I sort that, so much else would come off the back of that.
Absolutely. And I think the thing is, people find that really difficult to do. I think they know that it's something that they should do. They ought to adapt their environment or remove themselves from a situation that feels particularly toxic. But I think we're not even that great at doing it when it comes to social media. So when I speak to clients that I see, one of the big things they find is that they're affected by the content that they're consuming on social media. And it's like, well, why don't you unfollow these people? It's almost like there's this fear of bumping into people or offending people if you unfollow. But if, say, every time you reach for your phone, you're immediately hit with this barrage of sort of negative messaging, it's repeated insults throughout the day that are going to impact your mental well-being. So I would encourage people to look at their social media feeds, think about how they feel when they consume the content on social media. If you move away from that content, like yourself, Simon, where you feel inspired and feel motivated, great, you continue to follow that account. But if you feel anything but motivated, inspired, educated, positive, why are you following that content if it's going to repeatedly insult you day to day? So I'd really encourage, and I cannot say enough really how important it is to go through your feed routinely and to curate it, because it's quite intimate. If you think about, you've got your phone and you've got access to all these people and all these accounts, that is not going to eke into your day to day. And I always encourage people that if it's not positive, if it's not motivating you, if it's not inspiring or educational, so it can be negative, but it can be educational. So it's kind of making that distinction, that I'm not saying to you that it needs to be all fluffy bunnies and roses. I'm not saying that at all. But actually, how is this content serving you really? And if it's not serving you in any of those ways, having the courage to unfollow, or at the very least, mute the account or mute the notifications.
I think as well, like what's motivating for me could be negative for somebody else. The same account, just where, how it resonates with that individual person. And we're in a world now where 50, 100 years ago, you're comparing yourself to Dave down the street. And now we're competing with every single person that has a yacht in the world. Every person has $1 million. Every person has got a airbrush tanned photo shoot image. And there's almost a lot of, I think the focus is directed in the wrong way, in almost attacking the people for putting the highlight reel on social media. I put my highlight reel on social media. It's like, if you have a bad photo, if you've taken 50 photos on a night out, you don't show people the bad photos. And Instagram is just that next step, that public way of doing that. But it's helping people understand that, look, this is in the same way that your Instagram's your best features, this is their best features. And it's not a representation of somebody's life. Do you think during the pandemic, that approach has gotten worse with the fact that maybe the news, that's something that the people will look at every single day, has now become more fear-mongering and more scary than ever before.
I just wanted to touch upon what you were saying about the fact that content hits people differently. So, when I mentioned to you earlier that sort of start of your day and looking and someone started their workout and they had their breakfast, they're on their way to work. For some people, looking at that content may feel feelings of inadequacy. I'm not worthy. I'm just rubbish. What's the point? But for someone else, it might be the motivational step that they need to get them out of bed and to do their own workout. So absolutely, I think the content we consume will affect us all differently and will subsequently affect each of our actions differently. I think the thing that we found, particularly in the pandemic, is everyone was at home. Everyone was sharing content. And I think that need for comparison almost felt more heightened because, people weren't kind of going out doing things, that people were just in their home environments, and people's experience of lockdown and being at home was very different. You give the example of the yacht, you comparing yourself to someone who's a multimillionaire and you're sat in your flat or whatever and thinking, oh my God, that's so removed from my reality. So I think, again, it comes back to that point around making sure, are you purposely seeking this content out, or getting yourself back in the driving seat and thinking, I'm actually in control of the content that I consume. If I don't want to see this person living their best life, then I can mute that. Because I think often there's the fear that it may be too political to unfollow an account, particularly if it's like Dave in the office that you're going to be seeing when you come out the other side. So I think, again, it's sort of more considered that if you think it's going to serve you more aggro to unfollow someone completely, then it may be just about muting their content if it doesn't serve you. But I think absolutely, I think the pandemic did ramp up that sense of comparison, and almost I think my experience was who was locking down better, people doing their home workouts or people thriving through lockdown. Because I think there was often a misconception that people struggled through lockdown, but I think there was a lot of people that maybe found their feet with working out regularly, or maybe it improved a lot of their family relationships and friendships. So I think, again, it kind of comes back down to the sort of bottom line that there's no one size fits all. And again, it comes down to people wanting to share their highlights. And if that does trigger you, it's knowing you have the ability to be able to control that in terms of muting the content that serves you on your phone.
I think the thing that helped me mute more people that didn't serve me is realizing that when I started learning a little bit about the Instagram algorithm, I'm not seeing everyone's content anyway. Yeah. So if I mute Dave from the office, if I haven't seen his content, it might not be because I muted him. He never has to know. It's just that the Instagram algorithm is not putting it in front of me. So I can sort of get away with that politics. But I certainly agree with that during the pandemic. I think if you want to see positives in it, you'll find them. And if you want to see negatives, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And during that pandemic, I said at the start, like, this podcast allowed me to reconnect with people, like yourself. What Zoom allowed me to do, I probably spent time with the people that were closest to me in Hong Kong, whereas now everybody is the same distance away. I can connect with somebody in the UK at the same time as I can connect with someone that lives down the road. So it made the world for me more sociable, because I could now connect with everybody I've missed. And I've reconnected with friends I've not seen for well over a decade, just because I thought, okay, I'm going to make the most of this and come out of it. But one of the things I definitely did in the pandemic that helped me is I very much muted the news. The way I was thinking of it, it wasn't serving me. And if anything happened that was relevant to my life in Hong Kong, I'll hear about it, and I won't need the news to do that.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, particularly during the pandemic, is there was constant breaking news banners. We had the Prime Minister's daily briefings, and you had, what your friends and families thought. You were kind of overwhelmed with opinion, speculation, sort of the breaking news. And I think the first step for me was having to mute those notifications for the very reason that you have described, that actually, if it's something of significance, I will hear about it. But I think one of the things that I felt gave people greater control is maybe agreeing a time in the day where you check with a dedicated news source, kind of bringing you up to speed with what's happened in that day. So, for instance, if you're someone that works 9 to 5, you might think, okay, maybe at between 5:30 and 6, I'm going to catch up with the news on this website. Because I think the difficulty is we're overwhelmed with news, we're overwhelmed with different mediums serving that news in different ways, different speculations, different ways of things being reported. And that can be really confusing and really overwhelming, and can kind of heighten that sense of apprehension and anxiety and worry for us. So I think if you can find a trusted news source, one that actually you think that is balanced, it's information that speaks to you, stick with that. Don't do this thing where you kind of seek out alternatives or kind of just heighten what's already maybe a distressing story. Actually, if it's something, because I think the problem with 24-hour news channels is it just repeats the same story, same headlines over and over again, that all it does is keep you in that state of high alert.
You can get in a wormhole as well, right? Like you find a news story and then you get interested, and then you just find other bits of information to learn more about it. And you're a couple of hours gone of learning about this horrendous thing. It's like, there's a better way of looking after myself here.
Absolutely. And I think it's not about, what I'm not saying is put the blinkers on and pretend it's not happening. Absolutely, there are things that are happening in the world that you need to know about and that are harrowing and that are difficult. But it's about, again, putting yourself in the driving seat, controlling when you consume that information. When is the best time for you to consume? Halfway through a workday is probably not the best time for you to be consuming that information. Maybe it's first thing on the morning to the commute, or maybe it's last thing at night when you're on the commute back. But picking a time that you know that you're in a space better to consume that information.
When it comes to social media, in terms of how it portrays mental health now, there's a lot of good things coming out there, and obviously you're part of that good things that are out there. Do you think mental health struggles are becoming more prominent, or do we just hear about them more than ever before?
I think it's a combination. So I think, people have always struggled with their mental health in some shape or form. But I think what social media has allowed people to do is utilize that platform to share their experience. And there is a sense of unity, we're in this together. I think one thing with sort of mental illness or disorders, it can feel like you're alone with it. It can feel like you're the only one going through it. And actually, if you log onto social media and you find that this person is also experiencing the same difficulties you are, there can be a sense of reassurance from that, and a sense of, okay, they've got through it the other side. So those sort of stories of hope actually are really, really important, particularly if you're in the early stages of and grips of a mental illness or disorder. So I think actually that is really, really important. And I think it's giving people more the confidence to be able to share their own experiences. So it may be that those people were always struggling, but they've since had the confidence to share, which almost gives the impression that it's more prevalent than it is. But I think also we've almost learned a bit of a language around sort of mental health and difficulties. And I think it can be difficult to make the distinction between what is just experiencing a negative emotion and what is actually a mental illness or disorder. And I think all too often we use certain words quite interchangeably. Like people may refer to themselves as I'm depressed, but actually what they're saying, they may be just sad that day. So again, there's a lot of nuance. It's important to work your way through, because depression is a serious mental illness, and it's a disorder or illness that requires treatment. Whereas if you feel sad one day, that may just be a normal human emotion in the context of what's going on that day for you. So I think often there can be a lot of information to sift through on social media, and it may appear that a lot of people are struggling with their mental health, but it may not be to the degree of a mental illness or disorder. I think it's just people finding now the language to use, finding comfort in shared experiences. I think we're recognizing, for males in particular, suicide remains the biggest killer for young males. And, September is Suicide Awareness Month. And I think it is important that we do still have those awareness campaigns. And the best way of moving those awareness campaigns are through social media, to make sure that it's something that is consistent, something that becomes the norm. I think, say, for instance, if you were to say to me, I've got a headache, that would be almost a socially acceptable thing for you to say. And it would be socially acceptable for me to say, have you taken any painkillers for it? Whereas I don't think we're quite there with mental illness. in the sense that there is still a lot of shame, a lot of stigma that we absolutely need to eradicate. And I think positive messaging through social media is definitely a first step in doing that.
I think understanding as well. I can totally relate to what you're saying about the terminology used and people overusing certain terminology. My fiance has, quite severe OCD. She had pretty much all her life. And the amount of people I hear now that it wouldn't even cross my mind before. But now I hear, oh yeah, I'm just a bit OCD. I'm like, oh, you're not though, are you? And I was only last year, something you think I've had forever, I was diagnosed with ADHD. And that's another one that's just talked about as almost like a common character trait as opposed to something that people struggle with. And I've started to become much more attuned to those kind of things than ever before. But the men's mental health thing that you said, that really resonated. I remember hearing that thing of it being the biggest killer, and that's terrifying. Why do you think it is that men seem to struggle, particularly at the moment, with mental health more than ever?
So I think, again, unfortunately, I think there's this, masculine toxicity, this idea that actually in terms of men, they need to be strong, and actually showing how you feel is a weakness. And I certainly see it clinically day in, day out, that often the young men I see will present far later than the women. And I think a lot of that is they've done a lot of hiding, a lot of, yeah, I'm fine, yeah, all right, and just sort of shrugging it off. I don't know whether with women we have this culture where we are very open and it is the norm to kind of share how you're feeling. I think things like Calm, there's certain charities that are doing fantastic work for men, and I'm hoping that will give men more confidence in coming forward when they are struggling with their mental well-being. I think it's about also creating safe spaces to do that. I think, for some people, it may not work just to sit down opposite them and ask them how they are. What are you going to get? You're probably going to get the shrug shoulders, I'm fine, and that's it. And I think a lot of the time, particularly when men do make attempts to end their life, when you kind of track back to how they were feeling, a lot of the time people say, I had no idea. The happiest bloke, you'd be the life and soul of the party. And I think that's what's even more difficult, is the fact that there aren't those warning signs. And I think that sort of day in the life exercise that I spoke about early on may be your first step to having a conversation with a mate. And again, it may not be the sort of one-on-one conversation. It may be, lifting at the gym. That may be your intro. It may be going for a bite to eat post-workout. But getting your mate into a position where they know it's a safe space to open up. And one of the tools that I use is something called face fear. Because I think all too often we throw about you're right, yeah, I'm all right, you. It's almost like a very quick transactional, exchange that doesn't have any deeper meaning. Because if your mate was really struggling, you've created this sense of urgency that I'm just going to tokenistic ask how you are, but I've really not got time to listen to this answer, but let's just do the how are you, yeah, I'm fine. And you never come back to that conversation. So face fear is about having a face-to-face conversation wherever possible. So whether that is at the gym, whether that is going for a meal, down the pub, whatever it may be, A is being attentive. So listen to what they say. If you're asking them how they are, listen to what they have to say to you. C is remaining calm. So it may be that you're really frustrated because this might have been the third or fourth time you've sat down with your mate to ask them how they are and they're saying they're fine. But keep calm, keep your emotions in check, because if you suddenly start getting irate or impatient, again, it's not going to convey to him that it's a safe space to open up. E is encouraging. So if you do get the shrug shoulders, I'm fine, just say, look, no, mate, I'm really worried about you. Are you sure you're all right? So just encouraging them to open up. And then the fear aspect is trying to move that conversation on from the I'm fine. So what have you noticed? Like, I've noticed you're not coming down with the boys for a drink post-workout. I've noticed that you're not going to the gym as much as you used to. Or I've noticed you're not looking after yourself. You're normally clean shaven. Point out the things that you've noticed that have shifted from their baseline. And then the E is explain. So put those difficulties into context. Because if I was to reel off to you a list of things that I've noticed negatively, you'd be like, what do you mean? No, I'm fine. Like, you're going to get defensive.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So being, explaining it, putting into context, saying, you've not shaved in weeks, man. Like, you're normally clean shaven, or, you're not joining us for a drink at the bar. Normally you're the first one getting the round in. So putting those difficulties that you've noticed into the context of what's usual for that person, what their baseline is. And then A&R is agreeing an action and reviewing. So your mate might turn around and say, look, I've just broken up with my missus. I'm in a bad way. I know I'll be fine. I just need a few weeks just to get over it. And then I'll be all right. I'll be back on track. So in which case, he's kind of given you an endpoint at which you would expect things to improve. So you say, hey, fine. How about we check in next week? Why don't you come round to mine and we'll do X, Y, and Z, and we'll check in next week. So making sure that that conversation doesn't stop at the first hurdle, agreeing an action, and it's conveying to your mate that you care, that it's not going to be a, how are you? I'm fine. Right. Okay. I've done my bit. Tick. And I think a lot of the time these mental health campaigns can almost make you think that the asking the first question is enough. It's not. It's the persistence. It's the going back. It's giving them the impression, the idea that you've got them, that you're there for them. So I can't stress, sort of face fear is quite helpful to kind of give you a more confident structure to those difficult conversations.
I think that's really important. And I think going back, that's going to be the part of this interview I listen to the most. Because I think when we do these things, there's a lot of virtual signaling. And I'm not saying that these people haven't got good intentions by sharing all these posts of, things like this, but I still think there is a stigma attached to actually listening to people. Like, I know when I've struggled in the past, people always say there's a safe space, but you're getting on people's nerves if you're trying to come up with a problem. You there's this thing like, okay, that person's like always moaning, or I don't want to deal with that, or it's almost passed off as you're almost pushed out of society a little bit for it. I think there definitely needs to be more people to understand, okay, how do we approach these conversations? How do we tell the difference between someone who's actually struggling and someone who's always negative? Because there's big things to notice. So, like, you've mentioned a few things there, like difference from routine, but what is the signs and symptoms if someone's starting to think they're struggling themselves and maybe don't know it's just something that will pass? Or, as you said, guys in particular come to you a lot later. What are the things that are often overlooked with people that something needs to be looked at, they need to seek help?
So again, I think it's going back to your baseline. Think about what is normal for you day to day. So if you're suddenly noticing that your sleep's off, you've lost your appetite, things feel more difficult or more challenging for you to be able to do. It may be that you're someone that's normally prompt at work, you finish your tasks that you need to do, you've got great relationships with your staff, but you're noticing that actually you're making more mistakes, or you're struggling to concentrate and focus. You may find that you are getting into more disagreements or arguments. So I think what's key is everyone's baseline will be different. Like, you just said there may be someone that their baseline is that they may be argumentative, they may be negative. That may be their baseline, in which case, if you notice that they've suddenly become withdrawn, less argumentative, that's a shift for them. It may not necessarily be for the positive. It may actually indicate that something's going on for them. So I think the key is there may not necessarily be a list of things for people to look out for, but it's noticing a shift from the norm for you. And it's thinking about, has there been something external that's happened that could explain that shift from the norm? So I gave in that example, you may be going through a breakup, in which case you may be, comfort eating, you may be glued to your devices, you may be struggling with your sleep, struggling to focus, but actually as time goes on, you find that those things improve as you come to process the breakup and move on. But if you're finding there is a persistent change in your baseline, and it's affecting every aspect of your life. So it's affecting your personal relationships, social relationships, and your working relationships. Then that is the point that you think, actually, something's up here. And if you've tried all the things that I've suggested, so whether or not it's getting your sleep in order, making sure you limit your time on screen devices, thinking about the people you surround yourselves with, and it's still impacting you in all those areas, then it's recognizing that is a time to seek help. And I think all too often people feel they have to literally be on their knees before they seek help. But basically by the time you reach that point, you've probably got to it too late. So what I would really encourage people to do, that any shift in your baseline that is impacting you in the areas that I've described, that is something that is worth hearing and worth listening to and worth you seeking support for.
I think you've answered sort of the next question I already had in that answer, which I think was really good. But I was thinking, what's the importance of like having clarity with someone's mental health? If I give you the context of me with sort of like ADHD, I've like suspected that ever since I was a kid. But on the other hand, in the last few years, I've been trying different things. I've been, my priorities have maybe shifted from where I used to be, and I'm trying to work out where the next steps are in my life. So I'm doing various different things. So for the last few years, I've probably not focused on one thing. Now, is the lack of clarity the reason why I'm actually struggling to focus rather than actually me having ADHD? Or is this something that makes those things worse? But I suppose the answer to that would be, if you're struggling with clarity, maybe you should seek help for that, even if it's irrelevant to any actual mental health, in inverted commas, disorder. Strength coaches, athletes, they all get psychologists to help them with their performance. Why do we actually need to have something wrong, if I'm not labeling that right, but why do we need to have a problem before we actually seek help to be better?
And I think that's the key, is that all too often we're geared up to be very reactive to when things have suddenly gone to pot, and then suddenly we're having to race around and try things that we hope will help. And all the things that I've spoken about earlier on, those sort of 5 key things, are more about preventative. So someone may be listening to this podcast and saying, I don't struggle with my mental health, so actually I'm not going to take on that advice. But actually prevention is important. It's not about waiting until you're rock bottom and then trying to get outside to morning daylight, doing it all at once, that you don't actually know where the benefit has come from. So I think what is really key, and I think it's a really important takeaway, is in the same way that it's always been drilled into us that in order to optimize our physical health, we need to be eating well, we need to be physically active, we need to be looking after our sleep. It's absolutely the same for our mental health. Even if you're someone at the moment that's listening to this that is absolutely content, that is not struggling in the slightest, you would do well to still make sure that you're getting outside, getting your natural daylight, exercising, eating well, sleeping, surrounding yourself with positive people, to help when you do reach that negative, you're in the best position to be able to make sense of that negative emotion, process it, and move on from it more easily and more readily.
I think as well, it's like saying somebody who is in relatively good shape should never, ever get a personal trainer because they're already in good shape, where most people will do that to be better. I went and saw a therapist for the first time in my life relatively recently, and the aim wasn't necessarily, there's a few things I wanted to work on that were struggles in my life, but a lot of the driving force behind going was like, could I be better? Could I be more productive? Could I be clear on my work? Could I be, in a better headspace to allow me to be more resilient to stress in future? So rather than even being preventative, it's more about like, okay, how can I improve where I am? How can I improve my quality of life? Because I look at things, there's always things to work on. Like I would go on a course, like I would go and train. Well, why don't I work on my mental health in the same way? Because there's always a step up.
And again, it comes back to our earlier point about there not being an end goal. It's just about making sure that these things become day in, day out. They become habits that we can commit to. And again, I feel like I don't want to overwhelm people with all these changes that they've got to make from day dot. It's about finding what resonates most from what we've spoken about. If you think, well, actually, I could really work on my sleep a bit better, then maybe that's the first change that you commit to. If you're finding it's maybe the sleep and the phone use, trying to commit to both at the same time might feel too overwhelming and challenging for you. So pick one and be consistent with it. Review how you're feeling after a few weeks, and making sure that when you are consistent, that you do it day in, day out. And don't overwhelm yourself, I think, is absolutely key. I think one of the best books that I've read at the moment is Atomic Habits by James Clear. And I think one of the things that is really stuck with me is actually, if you're trying to start a new habit, it's stacking it on an existing one. So I kind of hinted at it earlier on when I spoke about that morning coffee, that if you're someone that you have your morning coffee at home and you're sat on the sofa flicking through the news channels, actually, are you better served to get your natural daylight, opening the back door, sitting with your morning coffee, getting your natural daylight, or maybe pacing around the garden or going for a walk? So if you're trying to introduce the new habit, see where could you feasibly stack it onto an existing one, because it's more likely that it will stick.
Yeah, that's something that's really helped me. It's supplements for a while when I was like, I never remember them until I put them next to my toothbrush, because I always brush my teeth. So it's there, and I can then add that on top. Do you think there is like certain populations that are potentially more at risk? When I'm saying this, I'm not talking about necessarily even genders or races, but more times in people's lives. I see a lot of things at the moment where people sort of hit 30, and I kind of experienced this, where that is a time where people often struggle with their mental health, particularly guys, I think, where they've had a certain priority in the way they've lived their life in their 20s, and then you get to this point when the 30s where I'm I'm no longer a kid, but I don't quite feel like an adult. And what was important to me 5 years ago isn't important to me anymore. But you're also thinking about, well, this is the time I need to start maybe settling down, or I should be more financially stable. Do you feel that whether it's 30s, 40s, is there, when you see people come into your practice, is there more, like ages or demographics that are more potentially at risk of struggles?
I think not necessarily, but I think what you've kind of hit there is kind of this idea about shoulds, musts, this idea that by this point I should be doing this, or by this point I must be doing this. And I think often when we have those kind of really strong core beliefs, it becomes almost a barometer to everything else going on for our life. So if you do reach 30, you think, well, I know that by 30 I should really be married. I should have X, Y, and Z. I should have bought a house. And again, that is the thing that can fuel the feelings of inadequacy, that sort of rigidity around what that age or number represents for you. So I suppose what I would encourage people to do is think about what your core beliefs are, where they may come from. It may be that they were drilled into you from your parents saying, oh, you should be a doctor and you should be married by the time you're 30 and you should have at least one child. And actually, if that's the case, and it kind of gives you some clarity, I suppose, on why you feel certain ways about certain milestones. I think what's really important is to be able to challenge that, and also being able to think about what you have achieved. So I think all too often when we reach these milestones, there can be this sense of what haven't I achieved, and it'd be very negative and really kind of soul destroying. But actually reframe that, think, oh my God, by the age of 30, I'm living and working in Hong Kong, or I'm, engaged to be married, or I'm this, or I'm that. And actually, I think that is what is absolutely key, is making sure that we don't get caught in these sort of cognitive distortions where we're immediately thinking about the negative and not focusing in on the positive. So I think trying to not get caught up in this black and white thinking, not getting caught up in these shoulds and musts, and actually focusing in on the positives. And I think that's why one of the things, and I think people feel that it does sound airy fairy, but it's trying to make it more manageable for you. But this is why daily gratitude is really important, really key for some people. I'm not saying to everyone you need to go out and get a flowery journal and a fluffy pen and start writing your daily gratitude. Just fire up the notes section of your phone just before you switch off your devices last thing at night. Fire up the notes section of your phone and pop down a couple of things that you've been grateful for today or that you've achieved. And actually, when you are having a wobble, when you are having a moment that you've reached a milestone, you think, oh, I have not achieved, look back at those. And I think those can be really affirming and really helpful to avoid you getting caught into this trap of, I've not done this, I've not done that.
I started the 5-minute journal recently app, and I found that really useful because it just guides me through it. And I think that resonates with me. I think, like, coming into my early 30s, I was very much thinking, I suppose I still am in my early 30s, but like really early in my 30s, I was feeling those experiences of I should be this, or I should be further along. And then I also think as well, as your values change, like my identity, what I realized was so wrapped up in what I do for a living. So when I get to the point where I committed almost all of my 20s to being the best personal trainer that I could be, and then coming into my 30s, and the way I want to run my business and the passions that I have are not quite the same. I'd like to maybe push this more. And I know this is a hard thing to make money from, but I would love to do that. And for a while I was like, yeah, but this pays my bills, and I've spent the last 10 years doing this. And it's almost that fear of taking that step back and almost starting again. But the reframing that I did was, one, I'm not starting again, because this is giving me my network. This is giving me my ability to communicate with people well. And thinking, well, if my values have been changing over the last few years, and maybe I'm not quite as passionate as I was for the day-to-day gym floor stuff that I've done, if I can get the level of success and work in different countries with a maybe 60, 70% of the passion I used to have, imagine what I could do now if I give something a go in the next decade that I have 100% passion for. And that, for me, allowed me to kind of go, okay, it's okay that things change. I don't have what's brought me to this point isn't necessarily going to have to take me to this point. I can start again, and it's okay. And there's starting a lot of guys at 30s get that fear.
And I think you think about the alternative, and I think that reframe is absolutely key, focusing about what you're hoping to achieve with this next chapter. Because I think, what is the alternative? And I think it's that sort of pros and cons. Is the alternative you remaining in a very stuck position and being unhappy for the next decade. And again, I'm not sort of encouraging people to sort of pack in their jobs, or, you know, because obviously there has to be a sort of a sense of, you need to make sure that you can afford your bills, that maybe you've got a family to provide for. So there is a sense that actually there's a duty with work that we need to do in order to be able to do the other stuff in terms of the basics, pay our rent, support our families, whatever that may be. But if you're able to achieve that with the next chapter, but you are going to have to come out of your comfort zone, isn't that much far better than being stuck and being stagnant for fear of that other thing not transpiring? And the reality is, you're not going to know unless you give it a go. And actually I'm someone that I don't like to live by regret, that actually I'd rather look back and think, I gave it a go and it didn't work out and I'm back to square one, but at least I tried. So I think your reframe is really positive, that it's allowed you to then move on to the next chapter. And I think people should take note of that, because I think that is a really important message to send out.
I know we also spoke about the negatives of comparison as well, but if you look at the kind of person that most people want to be, like the high status, I suppose, individuals, depending on how you define, subjectively define status, but it's people that are skilled in various different areas. People have lots of different social skills, lots of different hobbies, lots of different activities, but we get caught up in one path because that's all we've done and that's all we've known. And like, for me, I think taking that sidestep and getting good at something else is mentally more exhilarating, and understanding that what the last few years have taught me, even if it wasn't, you know, quite as driven as maybe the first 5 years, is that the quickest way to make any to lose 100% passion for anything is by making it your job, and understanding, a little bit like we said at the start about happiness isn't a thing that we could strive for, because we're never always going to be happy. Not every part of our career is going to be amazing. That if you work on your passion, you'll never work a day in your life, is something I very much don't believe. I think you can work on a job that stimulates you and that you enjoy, but there's always going to be things that you don't enjoy as part of that. That's part of any job. And being okay with that is the thing that makes you know if it's something you truly want, or it's something that we feel we're pushed to, or we just get a drive to do when it might not actually be what we really want.
Yeah, and I think with you talking about sort of passion, I think you almost can go the other way, that you're so passionate about something that you risk burning out because you commit everything to it. So I think there's pros and cons, but I think ultimately, if you're someone that you're feeling a bit deflated, a bit unhappy in your current chapter, and that you've reached a particular milestone and you think, I can't do this for the next however long, it's thinking about how can you improve things, how can you optimize your life so that you are maybe doing something you're more passionate about, or doing something that's going to challenge you or test you. I mean, my husband, for instance, has started Spanish lessons on an evening. I'm like, where has this come from? It's like, you know, I work so hard in the day, and I just wanted to do something for me, something that I enjoy. It's not good to say I'm going to like pack in work and become a Spanish teacher, but it's something that's bringing me joy. It's part of kind of my unwind in the evenings. And we went to holiday to Spain recently, and he was there speaking Spanish. And I think so I would never in a million years have thought, yeah, if you asked me sort of 10 years ago whether he'd be speaking Spanish, I'd be like, absolutely not. But again, it's not being afraid at whatever age. I mean, he's 40, 45, at any age, to try something new, because it's something that you're interested in. You know, it's never too late.
I totally agree. So to ask a couple of closing questions, one of which you've already answered, so I'm going to go into my other one. But if someone's struggling with their mental health, maybe they have a diagnosis and maybe have medication, but they feel trapped a little bit in their condition, or they don't know where their next step is, how does someone start the process of seeking help?
So I think if someone is not open to mental health services or open to a GP or whatever, I think first and foremost, I think it may feel overwhelming to go to the professional straight away. It may be just confiding in a friend or family member first off to support you in accessing that professional support. So I think if you've not spoken to anyone, it can feel like you're alone in this. So I think making sure that you have someone that you can go to. And if it's not someone that's friends or family, you've got the Samaritans, you've got wonderful charitable organizations that you are able to pick up the phone. And I think often for a lot of people, having someone to talk to that's far removed from their day-to-day can feel more valuable than talking to someone that's in it, that may be emotionally involved. So I think first and foremost is speak out. You must speak out, and nothing is too hard or too overwhelming to overcome. It's a matter of maybe you've not got enough resources yourself, and you just need a helping hand to get those resources. So I can't encourage you enough just to speak out. And I think if someone is already under a mental health professional or on medication, it's having that conversation with your professional, because I think there can be often a misconception that you seek support, you get the right help straight away. But actually, there's different types of therapy. There's different types of medication that may not agree with you. And it's important that you have those informed conversations with a professional.
I think that's really important. Also, knowing that the medication isn't necessarily the right answer. Like, I'm not suggesting that someone should ever drop the medication. I mean, I have mine here, but it's knowing that isn't going to solve the problem. It's not pill, done, don't have to worry about this, brush my hands of it. It's like, okay, this can help me get started, but then I need to do all these things that we've spoken about throughout this episode to sort of like help solidify this, whether the pursuit is to get off medication or whether that is to improve that baseline that you've already set for yourself.
Yeah, you've hit the nail on the head. And I think that can be a misconception that the medication is at the expense of all the other stuff. But for a lot of people, they may see me where it's too difficult to start therapy because actually they can't concentrate. They're so depressed or so anxious that actually the therapy work would be meaningless because they're in such a difficult place that they cannot cognitively, psychologically access the work. So medication may be the lift that they need in order to do the therapeutic stuff. And also the lifestyle changes that I've suggested are things that I would absolutely suggest people do alongside their medication, alongside therapy if they're accessing it, because that's the stuff that is going to give you the mainstay of the progress.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in particular, the sleep thing, that's one that I've talked about that on 3 podcasts in the last week. I've talked about the importance of sleep on mental health. And it's one I know I don't prioritize well enough. Like, I generally believe, I can't remember who said the quote or whether I randomly said it, but like, people that stay up late, and I'm guilty as anyone, you think you're getting more hours in the day, but you're just borrowing hours from tomorrow, and often that child's interest. And I certainly feel when I've had a bad night's sleep, I see it really quickly in my mood. So I think I'm gonna take that advice. I'm gonna turn my screens off 30 minutes before bed tonight and start taking the advice I'm hearing. So I've really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. For people who want to know more about you or want to follow your work on social media, where can people find you?
So generally, Instagram's probably the best place. So it's at the Mind Medic.
Well, thank you very much again. I really appreciate you coming on the show.
Thanks, Simon.